Have you ever had a moment in life where you looked around and thought, this can't be all there is? That deep gnawing sense that your story, your real story, hasn't started yet? Maybe you felt trapped in a role someone else cast for you, a title you never asked for, a life you didn't choose. Now imagine this. You're 15 years old, spirited away from everything familiar. Your language, your name, your family, gone. You're shackled and sold to strangers who don't speak your tongue. You're not just lost, you're erased. That's how Melkorka's story begins, not with a crown, not with a throne, but with silence. She was taken, most likely during one of the violent Norse raids along the coasts of Ireland or Eastern Europe, sometime in the 10th century. These raids were swift, merciless, and terrifying. Villages burned before dawn. Families scattered. Children, especially young girls, were easy targets, easy to capture, easier to sell. Melkorka ended up on a ship bound for Iceland, a land of ice, sagas, and gods who thundered with hammers. The voyage was brutal. She was crammed below deck, half-starved, her skin burning with salt and fear. No one asked her name, no one cared. She was cargo, and when she arrived, she was purchased by a wealthy Icelandic chieftain named Höskuldur Dala Kolsson. Höskuldur had money, land, and a reputation to maintain. Buying a young female slave was not unusual. It was, in fact, status-affirming. A wealthy man could keep many servants. No one blinked an eye. But Höskuldur's household soon discovered that their new possession was strange. She didn't speak. Not a word. Not even under threat. She worked silently, efficiently, always watching but never responding. Some thought she was mute. Others feared she was cursed. In Viking culture, silence was unsettling. It left too much, room for guessing. And Vikings were people of stories, songs, sagas. Melkorka's refusal to speak made her a mystery. And a mystery was dangerous. But the truth was far more extraordinary than they could have imagined. Melkorka wasn't silent out of ignorance. She was silent because it was the only power she had left. You see, Melkorka was no peasant. According to the Icelandic sagas, specifically the Laxdæla saga, she was the daughter of an Irish king, a princess kidnapped in war, shipped across the sea like a sack of grain. Her silence wasn't a weakness. It was a protest. And then one day, it broke. No one knows what triggered it. Perhaps a moment of pity from Höskuldur, perhaps a lapse in her careful mask. But one day someone overheard her speaking softly in a strange tongue, not Norse but Latin, and then Gaelic. Her words were educated, elegant, nothing like a common servant. Höskuldur was stunned. He had purchased a slave. What he got was something far more complicated. When asked, she finally spoke. "I am Melkorka, daughter of Melkjartan, king of Ireland." Now imagine the tension in that household. A slave who claimed to be royal, a chieftain unsure whether he'd bought a fortune, or a liar. But Melkorka wasn't interested in reclaiming her throne. She had one focus now, her son. Yes, at some point during her time in Höskuldur's home, she bore him a child, a boy named Olaf, and that, dear viewer, is where the story quietly begins to change course. Melkorka didn't raise Olaf as a slave's son. She raised him as royalty. She taught him about kingship, dignity, and the strength of silence. She filled him with stories of Ireland, of court life, of language and law. She may have worn linen, not silk, but in her mind she was still a queen. And Olaf? He would be more than just a farmer's boy. Can you picture her sitting near a smoky hearth in the long dark winters of Iceland, whispering ancient tales to a boy with wide eyes and a noble heart? This wasn't just bedtime storytelling, it was training. Melkorka poured everything she had into that child, not bitterness, not sorrow, vision. She didn't try to run away, she didn't scream for vengeance. She played the long game. Eventually, Olaf would become a respected man in Icelandic society. He would travel, learn, and grow into a figure of power in his own right. And when he visited Ireland as a young man, Melkorka's homeland, he brought with him not just curiosity, but the quiet legacy of his mother's pride. There's something profound in that. Melkorka may have lost her freedom, her country, her title, but she passed on something no one could take: identity, dignity. The unshakable belief that you are not what was done to you. And isn't that something we all need to hear, especially as we grow older? That it's never too late to shape what comes next. That even if life has stripped you of titles, jobs, youth, or strength, it hasn't stripped you of meaning. Melkorka never returned to Ireland. But through her son, her story did. Now most sagas are filled with swords, dragons, vengeance, and gods. But Melkorka's saga is quieter. No dramatic battles, no burning villages. Just a woman who lost everything and decided quietly not to disappear. That kind of strength, silent, patient, stubborn, might just be the rarest of all. So when we talk about Viking queens, let's not forget the one who never wore a crown, but carried herself like royalty anyway. A woman who understood that silence could be power, that motherhood could be rebellion, that memory could be a form of revenge. Let's keep going. Because Melkorka's story, believe it or not, is only just beginning. There's something peculiar about Iceland. Even in its earliest days, when it was just a scattering of turf-roofed longhouses tucked into the snow, it had a way of preserving stories. Not just the tales of kings and warriors, but the quiet ones. The ones whispered from mother to son in the dark. Iceland didn't forget Melkorka, and neither did her son Olaf, or Olaf the Peacock, as he would later be called. Yes, the Icelanders did love their nicknames. Grew into one of the most distinguished men of his generation. He was handsome, intelligent, and charismatic, a natural leader. But it wasn't just luck or lineage that shaped him, it was her. You see, while other children were learning how to sharpen spears or recite sagas of Thor's battles, Olaf was learning the art of diplomacy, of listening, of speaking many languages. These weren't just the tools of a chieftain, they were the tools of a future legend. And that foundation came not from his father, the landowner, but from the silent woman the household had once called the mute slave. Now that's the delicious irony of Melkorka's story, isn't it? She had been silenced, and yet she raised a voice that would carry her legacy further than she ever could have imagined. But here's the thing. Iceland wasn't exactly a land of second chances, especially not for women, especially not for slaves. Melkorka was still seen by most as an outsider, an oddity, a woman who refused to behave the way society expected her to. She didn't remarry. She didn't integrate. Instead, she chose exile. Yes, chose it. At one point, she moved away from Höskuldar's household to live with her son in a more remote part of Iceland. Some say it was for her dignity. Others say it was because she and Höskuldar had quarreled. But I like to think it was because she knew she no longer needed to be someone's possession to survive. Imagine the strength that takes. To look at a society that's never truly accepted you and say, "No, thank you. I'll live my life on my terms." Melkorka in exile remained a teacher, a matriarch, a source of pride for Olaf, who never once tried to erase his mother's origin. In fact, quite the opposite. He boasted of it. He spoke often of her royal blood, of her wisdom, of her endurance. And through his pride, she became visible again. Now, for those of us living in a world that often measures value by visibility, it's easy to forget just how powerful quiet impact can be. Melkorka didn't build a kingdom. She built a legacy. And that legacy endured, not just in Olaf, but in the sagas themselves. Because, you see, the Vikings had a tradition of storytelling. And not just around campfires. They wrote it down. They carved it into memory. And even centuries later, the Laxdæla saga preserved her name, not just as a slave or even as a queen, but as a woman who mattered. That's rare, very rare, especially for women of that era. Most vanished without a trace. And now let's step into the moment that truly cemented her legacy. When Olaf came of age, he decided to make a journey, not just any journey. He traveled all the way to Ireland to meet the family Melkorka had spoken of, to see the land she had left behind in chains. Imagine that for a moment. A son standing on the soil of his mother's homeland, seeking the royal family she once belonged to, trying to trace a thread back through war and silence and time. That journey wasn't easy. Ireland was in political chaos, fractured kingdoms, shifting alliances, tribal warfare. But Olaf didn't go as a beggar. He went as the son of a noblewoman. He walked into Irish courts and introduced himself not as a Viking, but as the grandson of King Melkorka, and it worked. The Irish nobility welcomed him. They recognized the bloodline. And in that moment, Melkorka's voice, once silenced by chains, echoed across the sea. That reunion, that recognition was more than symbolic. It was a restoration, a correction. A woman who had been stripped of everything had, through her son, reclaimed her place in the world. But Melkorka never saw that moment. She never returned to Ireland. She never stood again on the green hills of her childhood, and yet her spirit did, and I think that's the heart of her story. You don't need to finish your journey to change the course of it. Sometimes you plant the seed and let someone else carry it forward. Sometimes survival is the revolution. Now you might be wondering, why don't we hear more about her? Why hasn't Netflix snapped up this story yet? Well, maybe it's because Melkorka's power wasn't flashy. She didn't swing a sword, she didn't lead a rebellion, she raised a child, she taught a language. She remembered who she was when the world tried to erase it. And that's a kind of heroism we rarely celebrate. There's something deeply comforting about that, isn't there? Especially for those of us who've lived long enough to know that life rarely goes as planned, that the loudest voices aren't always the wisest, that sometimes the most lasting changes come from the quietest rooms. Melkorka reminds us that dignity isn't something anyone can give you or take from you. It's something you hold on to, even when no one's looking, especially then. So if you've ever felt like your best days are behind you, or like your voice doesn't matter anymore, think of her. The girl who said nothing until her silence became a roar across generations. And as for Olaf, his story isn't over either. There's an old Icelandic saying, "It is better to suffer injustice than to commit it." And if Melkorka ever lived by a motto, that might have been it. But her son Olaf, he would be the one to carry out her silent rebellion, not with swords or fire, but with presence, diplomacy, and a touch of the unexpected. You see, Olaf the Peacock didn't earn that nickname by being bashful. The name came from the bright, colourful cloaks he wore, his elegant manners, his taste for foreign goods, and his unmistakable charisma. In a society where most men dressed like the landscape, grey, brown, practical, Olaf shimmered. And yet, beneath all that silk and swagger, was a man shaped by pain, patience, and pride, passed down from a woman who had to teach him everything from the shadows. He never forgot that. He never tried to erase it. In fact, he built his entire reputation on it. By the time Olaf reached adulthood, Iceland was no longer the wild frontier it had once been. Communities were organizing. Chieftains were locking horns over land and law. Saga tellers and skalds wandered the countryside, preserving family legacies in verse. In this evolving society, a man like Olaf was rare, educated, well-traveled, and, most shockingly of all, willing to use words instead of weapons. He became a godi, or chieftain priest. He settled disputes, he held feasts, he was invited to foreign courts and even traveled to Norway and beyond. And every time he entered a new hall, people noticed. He didn't just look different, he felt different. That's Melkorka's doing. She didn't teach him to conquer. She taught him to command without raising his voice. She taught him that nobility wasn't a title. It was a way of behaving, especially when the world refused to acknowledge it. Now let me paint you a picture. It's winter. The long Icelandic dark has crept in. The air is sharp enough to cut your breath. Inside a longhouse the fire crackles, and the scent of roasted lamb and mead fills the air. Elders gather, children sit cross-legged, and a saga teller begins to speak. Tonight's story isn't about Odin or Thor. It's about a woman from a distant land. A woman whose name was once lost, whose voice was once stolen. A woman who refused to vanish. And there, at the center of the room, sits Olaf, listening with the rest. Because the story is about his mother. It's difficult to explain just how rare that is. Women, especially enslaved women, rarely made it into the sagas. When they did, it was often as background figures, wives, victims, witches. But Melkorka, she earned her place not through violence or scandal, but through quiet power. She lived in such a way that centuries later, people still spoke her name and wrote it down. There's something profoundly moving about that, because when you think about legacy, what comes to mind? Wealth? Fame? A statue in a square? Melkorka had none of those. What she had was influence, not over nations, but over hearts, over the shape of her son's future, over the way Iceland remembered her. And here's the thing about Iceland, they didn't just tell stories to entertain. They told stories to teach, to warn, to inspire. And what Melkorka's tale taught was this: silence is not the same as surrender, and endurance is not the same as defeat. Now, let's look at the woman from a different angle. Imagine her not as a historical figure, but as a human being. An aging mother, watching her son become more than she ever dreamed possible. Hearing of his travels to Ireland, of how he was embraced by kings as one of their own, did she feel vindicated, relieved, or just tired? No one knows what became of Melkorka in her final years. The sagas don't tell us how she died or where. She was buried. There's no memorial, no monument, and maybe that's fitting, because she didn't live a life that fit inside marble. She lived in memory, and in many ways isn't that stronger? Stone crumbles, statues fall, but stories last. And here's something even more interesting. Modern scholars, real historians with PhDs and glasses and all, still debate Melkorka's origins. Was she truly the daughter of an Irish king? Was her story embellished by Olaf to elevate his family's status? Was it all just clever saga-making? It doesn't matter, because regardless of bloodlines or exact geography, the truth is this: Melkorka mattered. She mattered enough to be remembered. She mattered enough to shape a man, a family, a saga. And isn't that what we're all hoping for in the end? That we mattered? That we left something better behind than what we inherited? Melkorka may have lost everything, but she passed on something far greater than gold. The belief that who you are inside is never defined by where you begin. And let's not pretend that's an easy thing to do. Especially for older adults watching this, who've seen decades of change, of challenge, of being underestimated. You know how hard it is to hold on to your sense of self when the world keeps trying to rewrite your story. But maybe that's why Melkorka's tale still resonates. Because it's not about royalty, or even Vikings, it's about quiet courage. The kind that doesn't make headlines but changes lives. It's about showing up day after day, teaching your child what it means to be dignified, believing in your own worth, even when no one else does. And it's about knowing, deep in your bones, that even if history forgets your name, it can never erase your impact. Melkorka lived a life of silence, but she left behind an echo, and we're still hearing it. There's a moment in every story, especially the quiet ones, when you realize the hero isn't going to win in the usual way. There's no grand coronation, no triumphal return, no crown placed ceremoniously on a weary brow. In Melkorka's case, the ending is not a climax but a kind of gentle vanishing, a soft fade into the backdrop of Iceland's snowy past, and yet her story refuses to die. What's so fascinating about Melkorka is that she never asked to be remembered. She didn't dictate sagas or inscribe monuments. She didn't found a kingdom or start a revolution. All she did was live, deliberately, fiercely, and without apology. And somehow that was enough to outlive 1,000 forgettable kings. Even today, centuries later, she still stirs debate among scholars, stirs imagination among storytellers, and stirs something quiet but powerful in those who hear her name. Think about the world she lived in. In Iceland during the 10th century, women had more rights than in many other parts of medieval Europe. They could divorce, they could inherit property. But let's be clear, that didn't apply to slaves. Slaves had no rights, no voices, no futures, and yet here was Melkorka, an enslaved woman raising a future chieftain, not through rebellion but through resilience, not through might but through memory. There's a moment in the Laxdæla saga, the medieval Icelandic tale that records her life, where her grandson is being questioned about his own background. And proudly, almost defiantly, he says, "My grandmother was Melkorka, the daughter of a king." That right there is a generational echo. It reminds us that sometimes what we pass on is not just blood or name, but belief. Belief in identity. Belief in dignity. Belief that the line between slave and queen is not always as thick as the world would have us think. Now imagine yourself in her shoes. You're ripped from your home. Everything you knew is gone. You're thrown into a foreign land, expected, to work, to obey, to disappear. Most people would shut down, some would break. Melkorka waited. She waited until the moment was right. And then she opened her mouth and changed the entire trajectory of her life, not by demanding power, but by declaring identity. That one act, speaking, was both dangerous and divine. And here's the question I keep coming back to. How many Melkorkas have there been in history? How many women were silenced, erased, renamed, resold, and yet still left behind ripples big enough to bend time? We may never know their names, but we can recognize their echoes. And maybe that's what makes Melkorka so powerful. She represents all those forgotten voices, all those people history tried to write out, but couldn't quite erase. She's a symbol of how memory survives, even in exile, even in silence. Her story isn't the only one of its kind. Across history, you'll find other women like her, enslaved queens, displaced mothers, women who endured, adapted, and quietly shaped dynasties, but few left behind such a clear trail of legacy as Melkorka did, through her son Olaf, through the saga that bears her name, and through the simple fact that her story still matters. There's something else worth remembering here. When Olaf grew older, when he became powerful and respected, he didn't try to hide his mother's past. He didn't whitewash her history. He honored it. And that is a powerful thing, because even today many of us feel the pressure to hide where we come from, to mask the messy parts, to polish our stories for public consumption. But Olaf didn't do that. And that tells us something about the way Melkorka raised him. She may have been silent once, but in the home, in the heart, she was never silent again. And that, more than thrones or titles, is what made her a queen. So what do we take from all this? Maybe it's this, that power isn't always about position. Sometimes it's about presence. That surviving injustice with your spirit intact is a form of victory. That memory is its own kind of monument. Melkorka never returned to Ireland. She never reclaimed her kingdom. She never stood before a cheering crowd. But she lived with such conviction, such clarity, that her name still crosses lips today, spoken not as a victim, but as a symbol. For older viewers watching this right now, maybe you see something of yourself in her. Maybe your story wasn't what you planned. Maybe it took you far from home or stripped you of things you thought were yours forever. But still, you endure. Still, you carry wisdom. Still, you pass it on. And if history has taught us anything, it's this. That might be the most powerful thing of all. So the next time someone asks you about forgotten figures of the past, about unsung heroes, about women who changed the world without ever raising a sword, tell them about Melkorka, the Sioux, slave who became a queen, not because someone handed her a crown, but because she never forgot who she was. That kind of royalty, you can't buy, you can't steal, you earn it, quietly, boldly, and forever. Let's take a breath together. We've walked with Melkorka across oceans and centuries. We've watched her disappear into the margins of a brutal society and then re-emerge, quietly and unshakably, not as a victim, but as a legacy. Her story has unfolded slowly, like a forgotten song that comes back to you in a moment of silence. And now we've reached the end, or have we? Because the thing about stories like Melkorka's is, they don't really end. They settle, they echo. They plant themselves like seeds in the minds of listeners and grow in unexpected places. Let's go back just for a moment to that young girl chained to the bottom of a Viking ship, the waves crashing, the cold cutting through her skin, the language of her captors strange and sharp, the future uncertain if it existed at all. What was going through her mind? Was she praying to her gods, thinking of her family? Or was she simply trying to survive the next hour, the next meal, the next humiliation? We'll never know. But here's what we do know. She made it. And more than that, she made meaning. It would have been easy to disappear, to fade into the ranks of the nameless and forgotten. That was the fate designed for her. But Melkorka refused. She didn't rise through war. She didn't demand her name be etched in stone. She simply taught her son. She taught him that he came from something deeper than property lines and Viking law, that he carried blood worth remembering, that even though she'd been enslaved, she had never been less than royal. What a thing to pass on to your child. Not shame, not anger, but pride. In the end, Melkorka left us no letters, no journals, no recorded speeches, only the memory of her silence, her defiance, and the man she raised to carry her name like a banner. And Olaf carried it well. He became a builder, not just of halls and homes, but of peace, of alliances. He hosted feasts that drew the powerful from across the land. And whenever someone asked about his unusual grace, his regal bearing, his worldliness, he told them plainly, "It came from my mother." In a time when bloodlines were everything, that was a dangerous thing to say. But Olaf never flinched. That's how deeply Melkorka had planted her truth. So here we are, more than 1,000 years later, still talking about her, still learning from her. And what exactly are we learning? That maybe royalty isn't about who your father was. Maybe it's about how you carry yourself in the face of erasure. That maybe survival isn't a pause in the story. It is the story. That perhaps our most powerful legacies aren't built in battles, but in whispers, in lullabies, in lessons passed quietly between generations. Now, I don't know where you are in your life right now. Maybe you're entering a new chapter. Maybe you're looking back at the chapters behind you, wondering what it all added up to. Maybe you've felt invisible lately, or unsure whether your story still matters. If so, I hope you'll think of Melkorka, because she reminds us that you don't have to be loud to be strong. You don't have to be rich to be remembered, and you don't have to be young to be powerful. You just have to live deliberately. Speak your truth when it counts. Hold on to your identity, even when it feels easier to let it go. And above all, believe that the impact you leave on your children, your community, your world, might not be written in stone, but will be written in someone. Someone who will one day say, "I am who I am because of her." That's what Melkorka left behind. Not a kingdom, but a compass. And so I leave you with this. If you ever feel small, remember her. If you ever feel silenced, remember her. If you ever feel forgotten, remember her. Because she proves, without ever raising a sword or sitting on a throne, that queens can come from anywhere, even from silence, even from chains, even from you.